I scratched somebody else's itch with a good grummage.
Ooh,
That will all become clear in a moment. But first, a short story. It's a tale as old as time. Computers are very good at producing output, and that output being partly human readable, but mostly machine readable. And humans are quite good at looking at patterns and seeing things in computer output. But really, if that computer output is intended to go into another computer program or another computer system, then it's not super well represented in a way that a human with their silly eyeballs can ingest it. And, whether that's a CSV file or a spreadsheet or any other kind of easily machine readable thing, it's often better to sometimes present the data differently. And that was the challenge I had that I wanted to solve. I had some data that had come out of a program. I'm being very vague, I know. I'll be more specific very shortly. I had some data that came out of a program that was intended to go into another program, but I wanted to look at it before it passed down the line to the next program to check it and make sure it was as I hoped. And the problem is, the lingua franca of sending data from one program to another these days is JSON. And that is problematic for humans, especially when it's very large volumes of JSON. If you've got an enormous blob of data with loads of indentations and it's vast, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the software that I use at work uses JSON a lot. And the standards that people use for formatting software bill of materials and vulnerability scans, it's pretty much all JSON. There's the odd XML, but it's mostly JSON. And I find it a little bit difficult because the tool du jour that everyone seems to use is JQ. And I know Martin's going to suggest some modern replacement for JQ that's better, is there?
Not really.
Good, correct answer.
There's YQ, which is the YAML equivalent, but lo and behold, it uses JQ under the covers.
So what I wanted to do was take the output of a command, specifically gripe, which produces a giant thing of JSON, and I wanted to read it. And what the JSON contains is a list of vulnerabilities that might be in a container. So I've scanned a container, and then gripe scans the SBOM, which is also JSON, and outputs more JSON. You can print a text table, but there's not enough room to fit everything on the screen that you need. And so it's better to have this machine-readable JSON file. So I've got this JSON file and I want to be able to read it. And I've run this past my good friend and nerd-sniping target, Stuart Langridge, and he didn't accept this one. So I had to do it myself. What I wanted was basically a JSON viewer. Now, what I don't mean is something that just gives me the raw JSON with little twiddly triangles that let me open up each of the things. That's not what I want. What I wanted was something that aggregates things together. So show me all of the critical vulnerabilities, show me all the high vulnerabilities. And then if I drill down into those, I can look at them by package or something like that. And so I needed to read the JSON in and then interpret it and slice it in one particular way to show me the critical vulnerabilities, and then slice the exact same data, but slightly differently to maybe show me from a package point of view. So show me all the packages that are in the system, and then I drill down on those and see the vulnerabilities, and then drill down on those and see the severity and so on. And initially I thought this could be a generic JSON viewer, that I could just throw any JSON at it and make a generic JSON viewer. But you can't really, because the formats of them are all different, and I needed to make it bespoke. And so I did.
Yeah, it's a bit like saying I'm going to make a generic database viewer, and the scheme is always different.
Yeah, I mean, JSON, it's a document, but it's essentially a database of vulnerabilities in my case for the JSON file that I want to view. Mm-hmm. And so I thought, how am I going to do this? And the answer is Python, of course. And I wanted to make it pretty. So I've said that I don't want it to just be one giant tree that I open up. I want it to be something a bit prettier than that. And so I went for a kind of split screen view where I have a tree on the left-hand side that I can open up the little leaves of the tree. And then when I get like 2 or 3 levels deep, I then click on a node at the bottom of the tree, and the right-hand side of the screen fills with detail. And that works. That, as a user interface, the typical file manager, like drill down through a tree structure and click on something. I thought that already works. So that feels like a structure I could live with.
And is this you're talking about a 2-pane view. Is this in the terminal or is this a GUI app?
It is a graphical application in the terminal. Yes. Yeah, it's fully in a terminal.
Right.
So the reason I did it in a terminal is because, yeah, there are tools to do this in the web and there are like fully fledged desktop applications to view these kind of things. But I didn't want to make something big and fat. I just wanted something that I could basically load a JSON file in the terminal because I've just run the command that generated the JSON. I'm already sat in the terminal, so I'll just pipe it to another command.
Right.
And I used a library, a Python library called Textualized, I think it's called. And I learned of this through someone at work who has written some interesting software using it. And I saw him do a demo of it and I thought, wow, that's really cool. What did you use? And he told me, and that was it. I was sold. And the really nice thing is it's quite pretty. It adjusts to the terminal size automatically. I don't have to do anything. And it's got all the user interface for like the tree structure, and it works with the mouse as well as the keyboard. So I can tab around and press buttons. But if I want to click on something, I can double click on something and open it in another pane. And it is super wonderful to work with. And it makes things look pretty pretty, even for someone like me who's a bit of a novice with Python. And this is the first thing I've ever done with Textualize. I just followed some of their documentation and there are some examples in there. It's super easy to use. I was well impressed. So I made the basic thing that slices and dices by severity, by vulnerability, by package, and so on. And I thought I'll show this off. And so during our coffee time on a Friday, we have a coffee chat at work. I said, hey, can I show you something that I've made? And I shared my screen and told them what it was and what it does. And someone else on the call who is a massive fan of JQ and uses JQ a lot and works on the team, unmuted his microphone. I thought, I'm going to get abuse now because I said something disparaging about JQ. And he actually unmuted his microphone to say, I need this right now because this will help me do my job. Because what he was doing was looking at JSON files from an upstream security vendor. So Red Hat, for example, Red Hat have changed the format or they're using a different format for the security feed. And he wanted to be able to examine it in a way that was nice and easy and straightforward. And this tool would have done it for him. And so I was like, oh, this isn't just me that needs this thing then. And so I put it on GitHub on the Friday night and then sent them a link and said, there you go. It's got instructions. I made sure the instructions were right. And you could just use a virtual environment to run it, and it works. And he's tried it, and it works for him as well. So it works on at least 2 computers.
So you were saying that you can't just make something like this for JSON files in general because they are too general. But the Red Hat thing you just spoke about, does that happen to use the same format that Sift and Gripe use, or is it something else, but it's similar enough that this can be made to work with it?
No, there's a different standard. But what he was doing was ingesting it and then seeing what came out of Gripe the other end. So mine is effectively a Gripe viewer.
Yes.
It's a thing for rummaging around in the output of Gripe, hence the name Grummage, which is a Gripe rummager. So I think what he wanted to do was pull the feed in and then use this as a way to view whether Gripe was getting the right data based on the feed that was coming into it, that kind of thing.
A lot of your colleagues are in the US, aren't they?
Yes.
Is rummage a word that translates across the pond?
Not so much, no. And that's why I quite like it. I sent them the link and they've tested it out and it works fine for them. And I had another play with it today, and I've made a little list of to-do items, basically issues on the project. And so if anyone else wants to help me out in some way, it's quite niche, But I could see this as a base for viewing other types of files. Like this could be reworked for the Red Hat Oval file. And Oval is a standard format, right? And so I've used it very specifically for Gripe output, but it could be used for SPDX files, which is a standardized SBOM format, or CycloneDX, which is another SBOM format, or basically any other JSON. It could be used. It's not actually very long. I think it's like 100 lines or something. It's not huge. And all you do is just run it with one parameter, and the parameter is the JSON file that it's going to read. There is one embellishment that I did, which I'm quite pleased with, which is Gripe has a thing called explain, where you can say, explain that issue, that vulnerability to me. And Gripe then interrogates the vulnerability database and produces a giant output of all the links to the CVE databases and all the other metadata about the security issue and what version you need to upgrade to and what files are affected and all that kind of stuff. And the nice thing is that giant blob of text fits in the right-hand pane, but it's also scrollable. And I didn't have to do anything really to make that a scrollable window inside the terminal with my mouse. It's great. I'm really, really pleased with it. And it was only a couple of hours of noodling around with a bit of Python and a library, and at least 2 people are happy with that. This episode is sponsored by Tailscale, but please don't skip. I want to tell you how I use Tailscale's free plan to securely share remote access to web applications I'm prototyping on my laptop. Sometimes I want to test those web applications from other platforms, such as mobile devices. With the Tailscale serve command, I can share a link to my creations on any other device on my Tailnet. I have Tailscale installed on all my devices, so I can access my prototype app from any device securely and without fuss. And if I want to share my creation with friends, colleagues, and customers, I can use the Tailscale funnel command, which gives my application a public URL for as long as I need until I close the funnel. It made authenticating my app with GitHub easy because I could use the public Tailscale link as the callback URL. No need for router port forwarding, and SSL is automatically enabled by default. Both Tailscale Serve and Tailscale Funnel are handy for developers like me. Many of the late-night Linux family hosts are using Tailscale on their devices to secure cross-device networking, and you could too because Tailscale's personal plan will always be free. To support the show and become a web developer like me, try Tailscale for free today. You'll get up to 100 devices and 3 users for free with no credit card required at tailscale.com/Linux Matters. That's tailscale.com/Linux Matters.
I've been going social down in the Fediverse.
Oh, not Acapulco. No, I'm not going to do old song references again.
Following OggCamp, where I was inspired by a number of the talks there about ActivityPub and the Fediverse in general, I decided that coming out of OggCamp, I wasn't happy just having accounts in the Fediverse. I wanted to be more deeply involved in that movement, that community, and that technology. So I talked about creating a server, which was going to be the place I was going to host and experiment with ActivityPub related things. And I have now got my own personal ActivityPub instance on that there Fediverse. And it is not Mastodon.
You beat me to it. So it's not Mastodon then.
It is not Mastodon. And that was surprising in itself, because I thought going into this, I was inevitably going to end up installing Mastodon. And because I'd gone in with that, let's say, misconception, I may have over-provisioned my server slightly. And I might have to downsize at some future date. But, for now, we'll just go with what I have. But I did a sort of a look-see around. There's a few awesome ActivityPub type listicles on GitHub and GitLab and what have you, and Codeberg, which list all sorts of interesting software categorized by functionality. And I was surprised at how many Mastodon-like platforms there are available. So I had a little look through those and had a bit of a tinker. And long story short, I have decided to go with a bit of software called GoToSocial.
Ah, I'm somewhat familiar with GoToSocial.
Oh, really?
I spoke in an early episode or two about writing my own ActivityPub integration for a static blog. And GoToSocial was how I tested interacting with an actual ActivityPub server by running that locally and trying to send things back and forth with it, because that way I had something that I could debug, which wasn't vast and resource hungry and complex like Mastodon.
Well, that's interesting, because one of the reasons why I settled on GoToSocial is, apart from having my own actual account, I want some test accounts where I can experiment with the API and prototype things, and I didn't want to invest a lot of time and effort in N-tier architecture, which is basically what Mastodon is.
Also, you don't want to be using bots in dot space or some other instance that's just going to disappear from under you.
Right.
You want to be in control of it, right?
Indeed. So GoToSocial is rather fantastic. For those of you that have not encountered it yet, we'll have links in the show notes, but it is a single Go binary. And it's quite clever in that, yes, you could have it talk to a PostgreSQL database. I've decided not to do that. Maybe in a couple of years that might come back to haunt me. We'll see. But it actually has, among other things, SQLite and FFmpeg and FFprobe embedded within it as WASM executables. So when I say it's a single binary, it is literally a single binary with all of its external dependencies bundled inside it, which I think is kind of fabulous and like next gen internet technology sort of being sort of showcased there. So whilst I thought I would use a PostgreSQL database to sort of back this, I've decided no. The project itself seems to be quite happy with SQLite. And when you go looking at like what modern SQLite is capable of, I'm quite comfortable with the fact that SQLite can handle my 2 or 3 account single person instance on that there Fediverse. So that's what I've gone with. And so far it seems to be holding up.
I've actually quite a few of the services that I run in containers on my home server do a similar thing. They have the option of Postgres or SQLite because they're pretty much API compatible for most, like the stuff that you'd use for a web application. And yeah, for each of them, I have a database file which I back up with everything else. And It works for the scale that I'm running at. It's really good.
Well, you mentioned backups, so I'll get into that now. Mistakes were made whilst I was setting this up.
Data was lost.
No, data wasn't lost so much as I just had to throw data away. So I thought I had read a good amount of the GoToSocial documentation going into creating my first production instance. It turns out I had not read the memo about these are your deployment requirements and understandings. So I had no idea that when you deploy something onto the Fediverse, when you choose like what that platform is, you're kind of stuck with it. Like it's a one-way street for 2 reasons. One, because of the protocol's compatibility, but also because of the keys that it generates. And once it starts interacting with other nodes on the Fediverse, those keys are kind of the keys. And there is no mechanism within the ActivityPub protocol for you to signal to instances that you're federated with that your keys have changed and need to be resynced. So if you mess it up, I messed it up, then those keys, it means that the new instance you deploy on that domain can no longer interact with those instances that it has previously come into contact with because the keys have changed, without you contacting 1,000 admins of the other instances and begging that they, rotate the keys for you.
Well, the good news is all you have to do is post one status update and then look at the web server logs, and you'll get the names of every single instance that's federated with you.
Yes,
and then just admin at that, then you're done. You could script that, and that could be your new bot. Is a thing that tells all these people, please defederate from me and forget I ever existed.
So you could do that, or you could do what I did.
Register a new domain.
24 hours later, realised my mistake, registered another domain.
Of course, that's the solution to everything. Buy a new domain.
Yeah, so I am now the proud owner of wimpysworld.social.
Wimpysworld2.social.
Indeed. So yeah, having realised that blunder and the fact that actually the database that backs your ActivityPub instance is very important in terms of the keys that are sat inside it, not just for the instance itself, but the users you've created on that instance. I realized I needed a solid sort of backup solution for GoToSocial. Now, one of the things that I love about GoToSocial is their documentation is absolutely fantastic. In fact, as a community project, there's nothing to fault in the way the project has been set out, documented, their sort of milestones and roadmaps have been communicated. It's really very accessible. So there was lots of good information about how to back up a GoToSocial instance, but there wasn't a tool to do it. But there is now, because I have written GoToSocial backup. So what that does is does a backup of the SQLite database, given that that is the common sort of database that's being used, and there are better tools for backing up PostgreSQL. But what it also does is it uses the GoToSocial tooling to build a list of what your local media is, so your custom emojis and any images that you've uploaded to your own instance, it will extract, and it builds like a hard link archive of your stuff and deposits that in a location so you can clone it off to like an S3 backup. So I've written this tool. It does a comprehensive backup of GoToSocial, and I'm now using that to make sure I don't get defederated from the instances, the 1,157 instances that this thing is now talking to.
What's the backup written in? Is it Go or is it Bash?
Yes, it's gold-plated Bash.
Excellent, excellent. I approve.
Really, because it really only does a few things. It does a SQLite backup using vacuum, so that's like a transactional backup. It creates this hard link hierarchy of the local media and something else I forget. Oh, there's an export feature, so there's like an export of like the basic configuration. So it's a belt and braces. So it's really only 3 simple things that it does, and then it automatically handles log rotation and retention of that 28-day retention of that backup.
So OggCamp, you were incentivized by the other talks, and now you're a contributor to the Fediverse.
Yes, I'd like to think so, in some small way at least. And if you are looking to host your own instance, seriously take a look at GoToSocial. The project is currently labelled as beta. It's recently exited alpha. I would say it's a good drop-in replacement for Mastodon. It's got an implementation of the Mastodon API, so most of the tooling that you use in terms of clients work with it. The clients that I've used with it is a thing called Feditext, which is a continuation of the old MetaText, and Tusky on Android. And what's interesting about GoToSocial is it doesn't have a client built into it. So it's just a back-end implementation. So it's a bring your own client. So there's some web clients called Pinafore and Semaphore, and I've been using those to log in over the web. So if you're looking for an instance to play around with, I highly recommend it, and it can even run on SBCs and is advertised as the way to get on that there Fediverse with low-powered devices.
This episode is sponsored by 1Password. Imagine your company's security like the quad of a college campus. There are nice brick paths between the buildings. Those are the company-owned devices, IT-approved apps, and managed employee identities. And then there are the paths people actually use, the shortcuts worn through the grass that are the straightest line from point A to B. Those are unmanaged devices, shadow IT apps, and non-employee identities like contractors. Most security tools only work on those happy brick paths, but a lot of security problems take place on the shortcuts. 1Password Extended Access Management is the first security solution that brings all these unmanaged devices, apps, and identities under your control. It ensures that every user credential is strong and protected, every device is known and healthy, and every app is visible. 1Password Extended Access Management solves the problems traditional IAM and MDM can't touch. It's security for the way we work today, and it's now generally available to companies with Okta and Microsoft Entra, and in beta for Google Workplace customers. So support the show and check it out at onepassword.com/Linux Matters. That's onepassword.com/Linux Matters.
Linux Matters is part of the Late Night Linux family. If you enjoy this show, then please consider supporting us and the rest of the Late Night Linux team using the PayPal or Patreon links you can find at linuxmatters.sh/support. For $5 a month on Patreon, you can enjoy an ad-free feed of our show. Or, for $10, get access to all the Late Night Linux shows ad-free. We love to get your feedback via email, show@linuxmatters.sh, or you can chat with us and other listeners in our Telegram group. All the details are available at linuxmatters.sh/contact.
Previously on Linux Matters, I spoke about hosting my own audiobook server with Audiobookshelf.
That's easy for you to say.
Everything's been going well with it, but I did mention last time I spoke about this that I was having an issue listening to certain episodes of a certain audiobook that are very long, to the tune of several hours in length each. And the problem there is that when it's trying to stream them, it can't seek them and doesn't seem to remember position very easily. It makes it very hard to actually listen to it successfully.
What book has 3-hour chapters?
So I say book, but in this case, it's actually an archive of a podcast. So this is the Critical Role podcast, but it's several seasons ago. So it's not actually what's currently on their feed. So I've downloaded them as an archive and I've uploaded them to my server as an audiobook in my library. And so I listen to them that way.
I was going to ask why you didn't use a podcast reader, but if they're not in their feed, I guess it makes it a little bit more problematic to do that.
Yes. But also I listen to them differently because with podcasts, they're coming in new and I'm listening to them as they come out. Whereas this is like something more at a leisurely pace I listen to, when I've got time. So it doesn't really fit with my workflow for having them in a podcast client either. I prefer them to have them separately.
Right.
So I did some testing and reported a bug on this. And it turns out I'm not the only person who's had this issue. It is a known phenomenon with very large audiobooks on Audiobookshelf. But I did find a solution. Someone mentioned in the bug, they said something similar, like, if it's a podcast, why aren't you listening to it as a podcast? Because Audiobookshelf does have a podcast library feature where you can stick in an RSS feed and it will download the episodes and then you play them from your audiobook server, which I don't use because I don't actually want to archive all of the podcasts I listen to as they come out. But what it does do with podcasts that it doesn't do with audiobooks is it lets you download one episode at a time. So with audiobooks, you have the option to either stream an episode or download the whole book to your device. But with podcasts, you can download one chapter or one episode at a time, which means I don't have to download 400 hours worth of Critical Role in one go. I can just download the couple of episodes I'm listening to now, delete them when I'm done, and because it's all playing locally, it doesn't have any of this issue with streaming.
Ah, nice.
Yes. So I'm now happily listening to this. I've got 2 libraries in Audiobookshelf, one for podcasts and one for audiobooks, which has all of my other stuff, and I can flip between them quite easily. It remembers my positions of all of the books and podcasts I'm listening to all at once, and everything's working. And it's all open source, it's all free, and it's all brilliant.